And so fiscal prudence became a tradition. And we laid a standard that running budget deficit above 3% is a no-no. We laid a standard that inflationary trends are a no-no because price stability is important for you to offer certainty and level of predictability for an environment. People can manage risks. It is much more difficult to manage uncertainties. And we laid the framework that double-digit inflation, no. We're going to keep it at single-digit. We laid the framework that the flexible interest rate, foreign exchange rate, to enable that sense that it adjusts according to the pricing and the productivity within the country. We laid the framework of interest rates, striving through fiscal activities and other monetary policies to ensure that the interest rate would be interest rate that enable access to finance, accumulate savings in order that investments may happen. We laid the framework of sustainable debt management, that debt is not necessarily a bad thing. It becomes a bad thing when you borrow in order to be sorrowful. And so the debt management became well organized to enable transparency, to enable value for every debt that secured, so that the economic benefit of the debt would drive the basis of taking any loan. All of these indicators came together to deliver what we got as a relative macroeconomic stability. That relative macroeconomic stability in those early 2000s became very important as a basic condition for economic growth. For without macroeconomic stability, you don't stand a chance to grow. But purely having macroeconomic stability is not a sufficient basis for the kind of quality of growth that you need in order to improve the living conditions of your people, because when your people are able to get jobs, when their household incomes increase, then the quality of life would increase. And so poverty reduction is possible only when you grow, but it is not guaranteed that it will necessarily happen when you grow, because it depends on the quality of your growth. Have you followed me so far? So we held on to this principle as we saw that macroeconomic stability, the prudence in fiscal management where you're not spending what you don't have, good, relatively right monetary policies, sometimes accommodating, sometimes non-accommodating, but in a way that drove toward a direction of economic growth on a sustained level, began to deliver. So from 2003, you could trace the growth rate that we began to post growth levels of about 5%, and then over time 6, 7%, and after a while, like, the world got used to seeing a Nigeria that was growing at between 5 and 7%. That was the story until 2014, when the oil price decline hit, and Nigeria appeared to have been unprepared for the 5th time for an oil price shock. How terrible can that be? How can it be? In the 70s, we suffered a price shock. We went down. In the 80s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, we managed to buck the trend, because in that era, a mechanism called the excess crude account became entrenched, even though non-constitutional. But it made common sense that if the writers of our Constitution were hostile to the culture of savings, common sense should mean that we would say no to that. How can the Constitution of a country not almost find it offensive for the country to save? So the excess crude account was a response to that, and it garnered healthy savings. Ladies and gentlemen, when the oil price shock of 2000 started in 2014, with oil price getting to the lowest level in 7 years and losing its value by as much as 60% for the previous decade, it was clear that Nigeria needed an adjustment consistent with the approach and method of economic development that it had become used to. Except that something fundamental happened. The fundamental thing that happened is that by 2015, we did an election. And the election later to show you how things can be shaped by the mindset, the economic mindset of the leader of any country, as we have observed all over the world. Our president has an implicit connection to the idea of collectivism. He believes that state control, command and control, is an effective way of ensuring discipline. Now that departs from the premise that economic principles have observed that the discipline of the marketplace is much more effective in the allocation of scarce resources for production and ultimately for distribution. To the extent, therefore, the symbol of this detour away from a path that had begun to prove that there was no exceptionalism about our country and that universal principles of good economic management can work in this country, we found ourselves with a command and control system where, again, the foreign exchange market has diverged and distorted the incentive system for allocation of resources by citizens, by businesses. So, what does that then say? If the economic philosophy is command and control, it must be only it must only be defended on the basis of empirical and analytical evidence of how well it has worked, how well it worked in the past, and therefore how well we expect it would work now. Well, during the first time of our president as head of state in this country, the command and control approach was the economic principle that he led. I don't think many people have been able